This is going to be a repeat of the video I previously made for the endocrine system. The timing will be just a little bit different than the other video, but it will have the same types of information that you need. So the first thing that we need to remember is that the endocrine system is a control system just like your nervous system was. So it's all about controlling homeostasis, different body functions. So your endocrine system uses chemical messengers carried in the blood and sometimes in lymph, and those chemical messengers are called hormones. So a hormone can be very similar to what a neurotransmitter looked like. We'll talk about that as we kind of get through this, but essentially you should know that that is the main messenger of the endocrine system. Now, hormones can only cause effects on target cells, and the thing that makes a cell a target cell is that it has the appropriate receptor. So the receptors are absolutely critical for the response to the hormone because that is what the hormone will dock into, and the receptor and the hormone together will cause some change in the cell. Now, endocrine system, you've heard of a similar term to this before, the exocrine system, but the endocrine system is very specifically about messengers carried in blood, and so therefore they're going all over the body. Exocrine glands instead have a duct, and that are glands like your sweat glands and several different glands in the digestive system. We're going to focus on glands that release their contents into the blood and not into a duct. Now, the endocrine system, using these hormones and receptors, is going to cause some different kinds of responses to your body. And in general, those responses are things like metabolism, which refers to how we use energy. Hormones also can cause growth, such as with growth hormone, for example. And we also have hormones that are going to regulate the fluids, so where the water is and how much water is in our body, electrolytes, ions, as well as acid-base homeostasis. Now, this is just a small group of the kinds of responses we can get from the endocrine system, but that's just kind of a basic overview. We're going to come back and hit this again a couple of times. So you may remember that your nervous system is also a control system. Now, the nervous system and the endocrine system act very, very differently. Remember that your nervous system uses neurons that are going to release neurotransmitter into the synapse, and the synapse means that neurons only affect cells with which they synapse, only directly affect those cells. So it's a direct effect on target cells that are in the synapse. It is an immediate effect. It takes place very, very quickly, and it is a short-lived effect, meaning that as soon as that neurotransmitter is out of the synapse, no more nervous system signal. The endocrine system is kind of the opposite. Instead of using neurons, we use glandular epithelium. And what this means is that they are going to secrete substances. And they secrete those substances into the bloodstream, and then those substances, the hormones, are carried around the body to the target cells. So this is much less specific than the neurons using a synapse. Instead of neurotransmitters, we use hormones. But there is a little trick here. Hormones can look like neurotransmitters. Okay? Now, because it's not an immediate effect of one cell sending a message directly to another, the effect of the endocrine glands can be delayed. Sometimes they're only delayed a few seconds. Sometimes those effects are delayed hours to days while enough hormone is being produced and released into the body and then carried around and picked up by the target cells. However, although that effect is delayed, it is often a longer lasting effect on the body cells. Now, this overview of nervous versus endocrine is not something that I typically ask a short answer question about. I could, but I usually don't. But you should be able to think of this and think about how your sympathetic nervous system, for example, uses both nervous control and endocrine control to effect all of those different changes associated with it. I always want to just use this particular figure from the book to show you some different kinds of chemical signals. Our endocrine signals, as we've already talked about, are where we have an endocrine cell. It's usually part of an endocrine gland that's going to release a chemical called a hormone, picked up by the bloodstream, carried around the blood. Body cells all over are exposed to it, and cell types that have the receptor on them are going to respond to that hormone. A paracrine is a chemical signal that can be very much like a hormone that is not picked up by the blood. Instead, it is released from the cell, and it is basically spread through the extracellular fluid, or the fluid that bathes the body cells in that area, and is picked up by a nearby cell. Paracrines happen in the digestive system, for example, and we'll talk about those just a little bit. And then the last kind of chemical signals that we might get like this are autocrines. And auto means self. So you're not surprised that autocrine chemicals are released by a specialized cell, taken into the extracellular fluid, but they also may affect the very same cell that released the chemical to begin with. We don't see this very often, but you may see this as you get a little further into your studies, and I think you should just be aware of what that term means. Now let's look a little more closely at the different types of hormones that you may have in the endocrine system. I broadly categorize these as amino acid hormones or as steroid hormones. Now, amino acid hormones could be an amino acid, which is a single unit of a protein, a peptide, a short chain of amino acids, or a full-fledged protein with tertiary and quaternary structure. Most amino acid hormones are going to be hydrophilic, okay? And what this means is that they are polar and that they are compatible with water. This allows them to be carried freely in the blood. They do not need a carrier because they will mix in that watery environment of blood. Because they mix in that watery environment of blood, they're more easily broken down by enzymes, so they may not last very long. And if you remember, the plasma membrane is a hydrophobic barrier, so your hydrophilic hormones will generally not cross the plasma membrane, and this is kind of important. I'm going to put a star here. Steroid hormones are kind of the opposite. They are made from a four-ring carbon structure that is cholesterol, and it belongs to the lipid class. So you know that this thing is largely nonpolar. Steroid hormones are typically hydrophobic because they are nonpolar. Because they're hydrophobic, they don't mix well with water in the blood, so they have to have a carrier protein so they don't separate out. But interestingly, that carrier protein also protects them from being broken down by enzymes that are in the blood. Now, because these hormones are hydrophobic, they generally can easily cross the plasma membrane. So I'm going to put a big star here. One thing that I want to just share with you, because I think is really interesting, is that steroid hormones often are built from the same processes. So, for example, we can use cholesterol and a whole bunch of enzymes to produce testosterone. Well, estrogen is then made from testosterone. Vitamin D is made from a specific derivative in that pathway of making testosterone. So it's not that your body starts from scratch to make each individual steroid hormone. A lot of them, hormone is made, and then it's modified to become a different hormone. And then it's modified again to become yet a different hormone. So I think that's just kind of an interesting little piece. And it does have some relevance that you may talk about in the medical community, where if you can't make the first hormone, then you can't actually make the second one. It's kind of interesting. It's a little complex, but it may be something you'll see a little later on. For the most part, what I want you to remember is that amino acid hormones tend to be hydrophilic, short-lived, and cannot easily cross the plasma membrane. Steroid hormones are made on cholesterol. They tend to be hydrophobic. They need to carry a protein, and they generally do cross the plasma membrane. Of note, we have thyroid hormone here that is actually an amino acid-based hormone, but turns out it's actually nonpolar. And what this means is that it's hydrophobic and it's going to act like a steroid hormone. All right, so we have these hormones. They are of different classes, and they have been released by an endocrine gland. They have been picked up in the blood. They're carried on around the body. So cells all over the body have been exposed to these hormones. Well, why do some cells have a reaction to that hormone and others don't? That's a pretty simple answer. The answer is receptors. So a receptor is on the cell. You may remember that when you talked about the neuromuscular junction or about synapses, we had a chemical being released by a neuron and was picked up by a receptor on the receiving cell. So you've already talked about receptors. A lot of the times we'll represent a receptor. So if this is your cell right here, we'll represent the receptor as being either on the cell surface and kind of sticking out like that, or we might have the receptor to the inside of the cell. And a lot of times I'll represent it, a little like that, the stick with the curve on it. So only a cell with the appropriate receptor is going to respond to the hormone. If a cell is going to respond to insulin, it must have the insulin receptor. If it's going to respond to estrogen, it's got to have the estrogen receptor. If it's going to respond to glucocorticoids, it's got to have a glucocorticoid receptor. So we have specific receptors for each kind of hormone. And as a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting. Some hormones can have multiple types of receptors. So you might have estrogen receptor 1 in mammary tissue, and estrogen receptor 2 in ovarian tissue, and estrogen receptor 3 in heart tissue. So you can have different kinds of receptors, but the idea is that in all cases, that hormone, there's a hormone, is going to dock into a receptor, and that's going to make something happen. Now, we call that receptor ligand signaling. Receptor is your receptor. Your ligand is your hormone. And when your ligand or your hormone binds a receptor, something happens. Extracellular receptors are required for protein and peptide hormones or amino acid hormones. And intracellular receptors may be used for steroid and thyroid hormones. And that's because those hormones, those ligands, can get inside the cell. All right, so what kinds of things happen when the hormone binds this receptor? Well, you saw in AMP1 when a chemical binds a receptor that ions channels can open or close. Same thing can happen with endocrine hormones. We might change which genes are transcribed in DNA, and this is going to affect which proteins are made. An enzyme might become more or less active. Your cells may secrete substances, so release something, or your cells may divide. So these are the kinds of things that can happen downstream of a hormone binding a receptor. I'm not going to ask you to repeat this list anywhere. I just want you to be thinking about the fact that hormones make a lot of things happen. Now, when a cell has an extracellular receptor, that means the receptor is sticking out the outside of the cell, and it's going to use a set of second messengers. And what that means is on the inside of the cell, a lot of different reactions are going to happen to finally make the last event occur. I'll show you that on the next slide. Sometimes these will be G protein linked receptors. Sometimes this uses a calcium-based signaling. This is not something that I'm going to ask you. I just think this is an interesting bit that you should be aware of. Sometimes it will start a phosphorylation cascade, and what that means is that a phosphate group, PO4, can be added to an enzyme, which will turn that enzyme on or off. The most important thing about these extracellular receptors is that they have a huge potential for a signal amplification. And what that means is that a small amount of hormone can give you a big reaction. That's the amplification idea. This picture is straight out of your textbook. I really like it. This is inside the cell here. This is outside the cell. And so what happens is we have our hormone here binding to its receptor that's sticking out the outside of the cell. But look, part of that receptor has a portion inside the cell, and it's going to cause a bunch of things to happen. We get a second messenger signal here, and here we can get amplification. And what that means is that you get a lot more signal than you expected for the little bitty amount of hormone you started with. Remember what your cell membrane looks like. I'm just going to take a second to point that out here. Remember that things that are nonpolar cross it much more easily than things that are polar. All right, what if we have an intracellular receptor? Well, we're going to have an intracellular receptor anytime that receptor is meant for a steroid or thyroid hormones, because they can diffuse through the cell membrane. So the steroid hormone slides through the membrane. It's going to bind its receptor, usually in the cytoplasm or cytosol. And then together, the receptor plus hormone, that's what we mean by the complex, receptor plus the hormone stuck together, it's going to go into the nucleus, and it's going to change the activity of your DNA and RNA, and this will change protein production. So this is a direct effect on DNA. And of course, this is shown in the next figure. This figure should say steroid hormones, but anyway, this figure is going to show you how a hormone that is a steroid hormone can slide through the plasma membrane, bind its receptor in the cytosol. Together, they move into the nucleus, where they're going to change how the DNA behaves and cause changes in protein production. All right. Now, your cells are going to respond a little differently. A little bit of estrogen causes one effect. A lot of estrogen can cause a different effect. All right. First of all, your cell must have the correct receptor. Now, I don't know how many times I have said that you got to have the receptor. So you can pretty well guarantee I'm going to ask you a question about what happens if a cell doesn't have a receptor or has a receptor that is incorrect or has been damaged. Okay? So you've got to have the receptor for the hormone. You got to have specific blood levels of the hormone. So how much quantity matters. And that's one of the reasons that we'll do hormone tests to see how much of a hormone do you have when we're trying to assess if something is going wrong or not. The number of receptors matters, and we're going to talk about this a lot in adult onset or type 2 diabetes. How well the hormone binds to the receptor. This is really important right here. So some hormones will bind weakly, but when a two hormones of a different kind get together, they may bind that receptor really well. This is a complicated concept that you would not normally see until you get to a little higher level of endocrine work, but I just think I should put it out there that there's a lot of different weird things that can affect how well the hormones bind to the receptor and cause an effect. We also have these things where we can have a hormone cascade. This is going to be super important, and this uses a concept called tropic hormones, and what that means is it's hormones that signal to other endocrine glands. And this is a really important concept for us. Okay. And then the last piece that we should talk about are synergist or antagonist. Synergists work together to get you a severely or a really highly increased response. So I'm drawing that up arrow for increased response. Antagonists actually prevent you from having a response. So an antagonist might block a receptor. We use antagonists in medicine all the time. So medically, you should know that antagonists will block the ability of a chemical to act in the body. Synergist, or when one or more hormones elevate the response a lot, antagonist will stop the response. Love this picture for showing synergist. Cortisol is going to elevate your blood glucose just a little bitty bit. Glucagon is going to elevate your blood sugar levels just a little bit. Epinephrine is going to elevate your blood sugar levels a little bit more. If you put two of them together, you get a somewhat increased level of blood sugar. Ooh, look what happens when you put glucagon plus epinephrine plus cortisol all together. You get a massively increased blood sugar level, more than if you just added up this plus this plus this. This is a synergistic response. When you put these three hormones together, and together they way outperform what you would have expected from each of them individually. We'll see this when we look at the stress response. All right, this is the very last slide on the stuff where I am prepping you to think about how the endocrine system works. All right, so your endocrine glands will sometimes increase their hormone production, or other times decrease their hormone production. Well, how do they know? How do they know whether they should release more hormone or less hormone? Well, they do it in response to a change. So it's always going to be in response to a change. Now, that change could be one of three major categories. So some endocrine glands respond to hormones from other glands. And this group of where you have a hormone that causes a gland to release a hormone that causes a gland to release a hormone, this is called a tropic sequence here. Not tropic, tropic. So tropic hormones are released from one gland and affect another endocrine gland. And we'll see this in the thyroid hormone pathway. Okay, so some glands will respond to that. Other endocrine glands will respond to things that are changed in your blood. And we call that humoral, because humors is an old-fashioned word that means blood. So blood sugar, okay, sugar's not a hormone, so we can't say it's tropic. Blood sugar causes the pancreas to change what it's secreting. When your blood sugar increases, your pancreas releases more insulin. When your blood sugar drops, it's going to release a different hormone called glucagon. So your pancreas is going to respond to changes of something in the blood. That's different than a gland that's going to respond to other hormones. And then the third way that we have of regulating our glands is by the nervous system. The adrenal medulla is the best example of this because your sympathetic nervous system controls the adrenal medulla. Okay? Now, in almost all these situations, negative or positive feedback is going to be involved. And so remember your feedback loops. All right. We're going to start with the hypothalamus because the hypothalamus is the part of your central nervous system that kind of has control over a lot of your hormone reactions. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Your hypothalamus is part of your diencephalon, if you remember, and it is connected to the pituitary gland by two different ways here. This hypophyseal portal system, and a lot of you are going, hypophyseal portal system. Portal is your important word here. And a stalk called the infundibulum. Now, within the hypothalamus, we've got a set of capillaries that will talk to the anterior pituitary. That's your adenohypophysis here. Anterior pituitary. And we have hormones that are going to talk to your posterior pituitary. All right, so your hypothalamus is sitting up here. Your pituitary gland is sitting right here. And we've got two different parts of it. So capillaries are going to send signals to the anterior pituitary, and instead we're going to use neurons to carry signals to the posterior pituitary. Right? What kind of signals, you say? Well, I'm so glad you asked. So, the posterior pituitary is going to make a whole bunch of its own hormones, but it holds on to them. It holds on to them until it gets a message from the hypothalamus here. So, your hypothalamus is going to send some hormones to the anterior pituitary and make it do something. For example, if it sends gonadotropin releasing hormone, this is called GnRH, through the capillaries to the anterior pituitary, then the pituitary is going to release gonadotropins. The name tells you what it does. If your anterior pituitary gets the signal from thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, it's going to release thyrotropin, also known as thyroid stimulating hormone. If the hypothalamus sends a message via CRH to the anterior pituitary, corticotropin releasing hormone, then your anterior pituitary is going to release a hormone that's going to affect the adrenal cortex. We can also have inhibiting hormones. So your hypothalamus may tell your pituitary, hey, stop releasing prolactin. We're going to look at all these things in just a moment. We've got growth hormone releasing hormone. That's how the hypothalamus tells the pituitary to release growth hormone. Or we might have growth hormone inhibiting hormone. That's how the hypothalamus tells the pituitary don't release growth hormone. Okay, so this might sound like a whole bunch of stuff, but I'm not going to ask you to come up with these, but I am going to ask you to predict what's going to happen. Gonadotropin releasing hormone tells the anterior pituitary to release something. Releasing hormone, releasing hormone, releasing hormone. If instead the hypothalamus produces an inhibiting hormone, now the anterior pituitary isn't going to let go of it. Okay? We'll have a look at this in class. Now, in response to signals from the hypothalamus or other things, your anterior pituitary is going to release some hormones that will be picked up in your general bloodstream and travel all over the body. Two of them are FSH and LH, and these are collectively known as your gonadotropins. And so what you might have noticed is that they're going to be stimulating the ovaries and the testes. Okay? We'll talk a little bit more about those later on. Now, these are the rest of the anterior pituitary hormones I want you to know. We've got growth hormone, which stimulates growth. We have ACTH, called adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. That acronym makes a lot of sense. And it's going to stimulate the adrenal cortex. It's in the name. Prolactin is a hormone that stimulates your mammary glands to synthesize milk. Pro in favor of, lactate. So this is not a tropic hormone, by the way, because your mammary glands are exocrine, not endocrine. And then the last major pituitary hormone that we're going to need to know about is TSH. Thyroid stimulating hormone does exactly what it says. It's released from the anterior pituitary to stimulate the thyroid. Okay? Now, it stimulates the thyroid to release T3 and T4, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Okay, so your gonadotropins plus these other 4 hormones are the ones I most expect you to know from the anterior pituitary. There are a couple others. These are the biggies. Okay, so let's look for just a second at growth hormone because the others are going to come up in a little bit later on situations. So growth hormone, the entire point of growth hormone is to provide fuel to your cells for energy and stimulate growth. Now, it does this by increasing how many proteins your body makes and keeping your cells from breaking down proteins as much. And so what this does is it helps your cells and tissues grow. It's going to cause you to have increased fats in your blood, so fat's going to be released from your fat cells. And that's because fats are your preferred fuel for most of your body. And this allows you to use proteins to grow, to build more cells. And glucose gets held on to for the brain. So your body cells are going to use up a lot of fat. If you've ever noticed kids when they hit puberty, they might have been a little bit my niece was fluffy. She was just a very soft and round little girl, and she hit puberty and she shot up and the fat seemed like it just melted off and she became this very lean kid because her body was using all those fats from her adipocytes, from her fat cells, to fuel the growth, the increased growth. Now, growth hormone also means that your body doesn't take as much glucose up out of your blood, and it adds a little more glucose into the blood so that your brain, which is extremely picky and only wants glucose, can have enough. Okay? So this is a glucose sparing effect. So glucose is not used by most of your body, and that means the brain gets all they want. Now, let me look at this again with you. So, growth hormone. Let your cells use fat for energy, make more proteins to grow more tissues, to get bigger in whatever way, and saves the glucose so that your brain can use a lot of it in this very busy time of life. Okay, so that's what growth hormone does. And it allows you to have repair and growth of cartilage, bone, and muscle. So we're not going to talk a lot more about growth hormone. That's why I did that here. We're almost done. We're going to look at the hormones of the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus would send hormones to the anterior pituitary, and then your anterior pituitary would release a different set of hormones. So that's just kind of a conversation piece there, right? It's like sending a note. The hypothalamus sent a note to the anterior pituitary, which would then go off and do the thing. Well, the posterior pituitary works a little differently. Your posterior pituitary does not make any hormones. It only stores them. Well, you might ask, who's making the hormones if the posterior pituitary is not doing it? Turns out the hypothalamus is doing it for the pituitary. It's a really weird little system where your hypothalamus has these neurons. Wait, Dr. Long, I thought you said that that endocrine glands, epithelial cells made hormones. Well, this is an exception. In this case, your hypothalamic hormones are going to neurons will make the hormones and send them down to the posterior pituitary for safekeeping. And then when those hormones are needed, they're released from the posterior pituitary. So it's kind of like a hormone bank. That's all it's doing. Fortunately for us, there's only two hormones that are created by the hypothalamic neurons and stored in the posterior pituitary that we're going to need to know. ADH and oxytocin are those two hormones. Well, what do those two hormones do? I'm so glad you asked. Your posterior pituitary hormones, remember, made by the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, are basically just these two. There's one that's antidiuretic hormone, and the other one is oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone does exactly that. Diuretics make you pee. Antidiuretics make you save water in your body. So this is about saving water in your body. And effectively, it makes you pee less. Okay. Diuretics we use medically to make you pee more. Antidiuretics make you pee less. It's going to be responsive, we'll see this in the urinary system, to small changes in the amount of salt in your blood or large changes in blood volume. If you don't make enough antidiuretic hormone, and let me just, by the way, this is abbreviated ADH. If you don't make enough antidiuretic hormone, you have diabetes insipidus. Wait, Dr. Long, I thought diabetes meant your blood sugar was out of whack. No, diabetes means that you pee too much. It literally means overflow, and it means that you have a lot of urine production. So that's what they mean by the overflow. So diabetes means that you have excess urine production. Insipidus means it's very watery. Diabetes mellitus is the sugar one. We're going to talk about that next time. Okay, so diabetes insipidus is a disease where you have insufficient ADH. You produce too much urine and you can get dehydrated. The other hormone that is released by the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. And oxytocin is important for labor and delivery. Oxytocin causes contraction of uterine muscle for labor and delivery, and it causes milk letdown. So prolactin causes your mammary glands to make milk. Oxytocin causes your mammary glands to release that milk. It has also been called the cuddle hormone because there's some evidence that it makes people want to have that kind of intimate contact. All right, that's it for this lecture. I know that's a lot of stuff, so I'm going to encourage you to rewatch the pieces as you need to.